You, as the chosen one, enter the Enclave oil rig, searching for your loved ones. As you sneak around the offshore base, you encounter a man who claims to be the president.
Hello, I'm the President of the United States of America, and you are...
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be going over the Enclave in the second Fallout game. Specifically, if their plan was right, morally. To discuss this, we first must understand the background of the Enclave. So we must begin with their timeline. The foundations for the Enclave are actually laid 4 years prior to the bombs dropping in 2077. This is with the 2073 race to capture the last of the world's natural resources. With this, the United States would get the last of the world's crude oil. This would be through an oil rig in the Pacific Ocean. This oil rig was built and operated by Poseidon Oil. Poseidon Oil primarily worked in energy, having a monopoly on the remaining oil in the world, but also did have side dealings in military industry. In March 2077, with the threat of nuclear war looming, the President of the United States and other important members of the government left the mainland, heading to fortified areas all over the world. One of the main bases of choice was the Poseidon oil rig in the Pacific Ocean, as from here they could still wage war with China with the opportunity to retake the United States in the future. On October 23, 2077, the bombs fell, changing America and the world as they knew it. This also cut off communications to the various other groups of the Enclave. With this time passing, the Enclave lay in wait, working on rebuilding their numbers and making new technology to have an edge over those on the mainland. We see this in 2198 with various inventions the Enclave began creating variations in power armor. Many of these in the beginning are no better than the original or are in fact much worse. In the year 2211, we would see the birth of Frank Horrigan, the future special agent and test subject at the oil rig. He would begin his life as a human until tragedy would strike. On the 1st of August 2215, we would see the rise to power of Congressman Richardson with the Enclave. This rise to power would not be done on his own. It was actually aided by his father, and due to the pressure from his father, President Richardson. In the same year, the Enclave would order that the scientists need to begin work on an upgraded version of the power armor. This would lead to many prototypes, many failures, and many versions being tested. Now we move on to March 5th, 2220. In this year, we would see Congressman Richardson elected as the president for his first term out of 5. This was once again through the aid and the pressure of his father, the former President Richardson. Just 7 months later, in October, we would see the successful invention of the Mark II power armor, with the 5 years of prior research having many prototypes and many results from those, many of those actually ending in death, explosion and injury being classified by President Richardson to keep morale high. Now moving on to 2235. With one successful experiment, the Enclave would attempt another. However, this would not be creating new power armor. This would be experimenting with already living creatures. They would attempt to create their own special fighting units that would be perfect for waging war in hostile environments. But with what creature would they be experimenting? The Deathclaw, of course. They would begin attempting to create their own special Deathclaw forces. Moving on to July 20th, 2236. Enclave scouts would stumble upon an interesting sight, the Mariposa military base. Now, the Mariposa military base was partially destroyed. Yes, this was the same Mariposa military base that was the Master's former lair, the base that the Vault Dweller had destroyed 74 years ago. With the discovery of Mariposa, it would lead to the deployment of Enclave scientists and the Chemical Corps. They were sent to Mariposa to go through the base and to search for anything that might be of use to the Enclave. However, they are not the only squads that are deployed by the Enclave to Mariposa. They also deploy assault squads. Their purpose is to scour the desert in search for not-so-willing volunteers to dig away at the rubble so they can gain access to the vats of forced evolutionary virus. One of the soldiers in the assault squads was Frank Horrigan. This was not his first assignment. He was previously a Secret Service bodyguard for the president. However, he was recently reassigned to some relaxation time in the wastes due to an undocumented psychotic break that may have endangered the president. In August of 2236, one of the Enclave assault squad patrols would capture Melchior to become part of their slave mining crew at the Mariposa military base. and a month later, work on the excavation would begin in Mariposa, with both super mutants and human construction crew working together in an attempt to gain access to the vats. Not long after beginning work, they would begin to encounter the FEV virus. This would lead to mutations occurring in the human workers at the base. Frank Horrigan is one of these humans that encounters the virus, beginning to mutate. He gets sent to the Enclave lab to be studied. In October of 2236, so the next month, Melchior would also begin to mutate. However, unlike most of the super mutants in the base, he keeps his intelligence and cunning after his transformation, so he is very smart for a super mutant. After he transforms into a super mutant, he realizes that he and all of the other super mutants will be killed by the Enclave once they get their data. As soon as the Enclave scientists discover all there is to know about the FEV virus, the super mutants are as good as dead. So he hatches a plan. He begins to use his talents, specifically his magician talents, which he used to use to impress people at bars. Instead, he was using it now to hide weapons from the Enclave. So when the time comes, the super mutants are able to defend themselves. Now we move on to January 2237. The Enclave had gotten all they needed to know about the FEV virus. As more mutations were occurring that would cause the second generation of super mutants, the Enclave would abandon the Mariposa military base. However, they did leave behind one squad of soldiers to get rid of all the super mutants inhabiting the base. This did not end well. As with the secret weapon stash started by Melchior, they were able to defeat the remaining Enclave soldiers. However, they did have casualties from this. The first and second generation super mutants formed an allegiance and decided that it was best to remain at Mariposa and create their own little community. Between 2236 and 2238, Frank Horrigan would be gradually becoming one of these super mutants. His physique changing into that of a large green mutant, his intelligence lowering by the day until he was slow and a stupid mutant. During this time, he was kept as a test subject. He was mostly kept heavily sedated to prevent him from attacking others. They operated on him during this time and just generally studied him. This would continue until January 23rd, 2239, when there were no more tests to be run on Frank Horrigan, so a new position was found for him. He was yet again to become a field operative, however in a different sense. He was to be used in tests against the local wasteland communities. However, some work would need to be done to get Frank Horrigan up and running for this position. This would be the construction of a new power armor to accommodate his sheer size, which he would be sealed inside of. After some successful field tests, on the 27th of March 2239, Frank Horrigan was ready. If you want me to go more in depth into the story of Frank Horrigan, let me know in the comments. Frank Horrigan became the essential cleanup crew for any of the Enclave's little messes. Now, let's move on to 2242. More specifically, May 15th, 2242. This is when the Enclave would send an encoded message sequence to Vault 13. This would activate its central computer and tell the Vault 13 community to prepare, as it was time to leave the Vault. This is when Martin Frobisher would gather the Vault Dwellers to make the tutorial movie that we see at the beginning of the game. Now, the next day on March 16th, 2242, the door to Vault 13 would be opened. Rather than being greeted by the nothingness of the wasteland, the Vault Dwellers are greeted by the Enclave, as there were two Enclave Verti assault squads sent to Vault 13. They were not there to simply welcome the Vault Dwellers to the new world. No, they were there to capture them. These squads would end up killing 3 Vault Dwellers for resisting capture, making an example out of them for the others in the Vault. The Enclave would storm Vault 13, rounding up its citizens and bringing them back to the Poseidon oil rig. A day later, on the 17th of May 2242, Enclave animal handlers would drop a unit of their Deathclaws into Vault 13. From a safe distance, of course. These are still Deathclaws, even with all of the modifications. This was done to get rid of anyone who was to come snooping around the vault and also to hide the presence of the Enclave. Another unit of Deathclaws was released into the surrounding desert area. This was to ensure that there were no witnesses to the Enclave's kidnappings, nor were there any surviving escapees. Not long after this, on the 20th of July 2242, Arroyo would be attacked by the Enclave, who arrived via their vertibird. These heavily armed soldiers were not readily welcomed by the villagers of Arroyo, with some fighting back and being killed. The village shaman Hakunin would also be seriously injured in the attack. Both the Arroyo citizens and the Vault 13 dwellers would be placed in the oil rig's prison cells. Now we move on to the autumn of 2242. This is when the Chosen One would arrive on the Poseidon oil rig, which was the main base of the Enclave. This is where the Chosen One would release the two groups and kill President Richardson after hearing their horrific plan. The Chosen One would then also destroy the oil rig. And with the destruction of the Poseidon oil rig, the main base of operations and the home of the president, surely this would rid the world of the Enclave once and for all. But anyway, moving on. So what actually were the Enclave's plans? The Enclave wanted to retake mainland America. Their focus was on the rebirth of America, which after a scouting mission in California after the Masters' defeat, they found many ghouls and super mutants throughout the land. This led to the conclusion they had to all go. With the people of the wasteland also being exposed to the radiation and the FEV virus, the Enclave also came to the conclusion that it was best for everyone, by everyone I mean the Enclave, to destroy these people, for true humanity to return to the wastelands. True humanity was essentially whatever the Enclave deemed humanity to be, which was whoever they thought should survive their little cleansing of the wastelands. But how would they be able to get rid of every living being in the wastelands? They couldn't just drop a warhead. That had been done before, and people survived. Well, they could try a virus. For this, they would need to test the virus to ensure it would only work on those they deemed unworthy of life. The Enclave's experiment required both clean and unclean people in their opinion. Clean people being those who had never been exposed to the radiation from the wastelands or the FEV virus, which was also widespread in the wasteland. This is why the Vault Dwellers from Vault 13 were the perfect clean participants for the experiment. Whereas the Arroyo citizens, being the Vault 13 dwellers who left after the water chip fiasco, with the Vault Dweller not being allowed to return after being the hero of the Vault, were the perfect unclean participants. They were from the same bloodlines, but they had exposure to the FEV virus and had dealt with the radiation firsthand. But what did this experiment desire to do? Well, they desired to eliminate the mutant threat, which was essentially anyone that was not a member of the Enclave on the mainland, as they were not exactly willing to cohabitate with the Wastelanders that had also descended from the original United States. So they focused research on cleansing the mutant problem in order for true humans and true democracy to be safe. How exactly would this be done? Well, through using a sample of the FEV virus, more specifically the FEV virus they acquired from the Mariposa military base, Enclave scientists were able to modify this virus to make it into a more toxic aerosol pathogen. So essentially a little droplet in the air, so you know what happens when you cough. This would be known as the FEV curling 13 variant. This virus and the antidote were apparently tested on some of the unwilling Vault 13 inhabitants and also some of the Arroyo villagers. These tests were claimed to be a success. With the FEV virus they had used, they were able to make a version that had an incredibly potent toxin that only worked on those who they considered to be mutants. This toxin was lethal to those so-called mutants. This then led to their plans of releasing it on the general population of the wastelands. The president described the countless potential victims of this as an unfortunate footnote in the continuing history of the human race. Because of the inhabitants of the wasteland being exposed to radiation and the FEV virus, the Enclave and President Richardson no longer saw them as fellow human beings, rather as a hindrance in the future of their nation, a hurdle in the rebuilding of their country. Their plan was to essentially restart the country, a do-over removing all that had been exposed to the virus and to the radiation prior to the Enclave coming back from their hiatus. They wanted to make the wasteland into America again. But were they right? The Enclave wanted to wipe out anyone they didn't see as pure, which is essentially anyone who is not an Enclave member or part of certain vaults, which is pretty much the majority of those inhabiting the wasteland. The Enclave would assume that all who were part of the wastelands were criminals, diseased, and downright evil. They also saw them as less than humans. They were not the real humanity. The Enclave believed that there was no ability to have a functional society in the wastelands as it was. With this, the Enclave would create and use something called Proposition 312. This is a proposition that mandated any person caught on Enclave territory that was not a member of the Enclave was an illegal alien and was to be terminated immediately, which is used when the Chosen One has an encounter with them in the Wastelands. This would only be part of the Enclave's effort to remove all of the undesirables, with the other obviously being the curling 13 variant of the FEV virus. With the attempt to remove all so-called mutants from the former United States of America with the modified FEV virus, the Enclave operate on a ends justify the means belief, which you can see from the president's prior comments about them being an unfortunate footnote in history. So essentially their deaths would be worth so little in the future of humanity. This in its own essence is wrong, as it claims one life to be more important and worth more than others. With the belief, it leads to a slippery slope that leads to an excuse for many atrocities. Once the initial target is gone and things are not perfect, they will move on to the next. Those who do not obey are seen as a direct opposition, a direct threat, not worth life. With this, excuses are made for worse and worse behaviors until those who were originally safe and part of the Enclave movement are part of the targets. Essentially, in pre-war Fallout, or in the now, the idea of wiping out an entire country because you don't deem them to be human enough would be considered a war crime, or a crime against humanity. Very few would agree that the ends justify the means here. Many of the societies in Fallout Wastelands were functioning and civilized societies with their own structures and systems. They were communities with rules and laws, which is the opposite of how the Enclave perceived them. So morally, no, the Enclave were not right about wanting to wipe clean the Wastelands. The Enclave are a more believable villain than some others. However, there is a lack of depth when compared with the Master. The Enclave in this are very the ends justify the means and have an inability to see where by leaving they may have lost the right to rule over their original homelands. They had not set foot there in nearly 200 years. They ran and hid with the first sign of danger, rather than trying to save their country. And rather than being on the front lines trying to retake the lands, yet again, they hide in their tower. So no, they are not morally right. They refuse to take accountability for their country and work to save it. Instead, they attempt a do-over when things look hard. The Enclave believes that this helps their country. However, due to their extreme distance, any help is realistically a hindrance to the country they signed on to serve. By being so far removed from people's problems before the war, they made themselves more of a problem than a savior of their own people in the future. All they do is destroy the land they set out to better rather than improving the land for their own citizens. Their plan would kill off all of the food as well as the people, as everything had been exposed to both radiation and FEV. If you enjoyed this video, then you should check out this one. It is about the story of Vault 15 and some of the important lore implications surrounding it.